Dr. White says, I want to know what John wrote. Sounds familiar. Wasn't that the question Satan in the Garden of Eden had God said? Any brief response to that?
That shows a level of confusion that is really hard for me to know how to respond to. Satan was asking Eve, who had heard what God said, to question what God said. We are talking about wanting to know what the apostles themselves actually wrote, because what they wrote has been transmitted to us in written form over the course of 2,000 years. That is a category error that is stunning in being able to even parallel the two. I'm sorry if I'm being straightforward, but that is not a thoughtful question. That seems to me to be an objection dressed up as a question, but it's not an actual meaningful question, because the fact of the matter is I was not in the room when Paul wrote the book of Romans. And so it is a perfectly appropriate question to ask, how can we know what has been transmitted to us over time through the church, through the transmission process in God's providence? That is not the same question that was asked directly to Eve, who heard God speak directly. Two completely different things.
That question was asked all the time, especially where I went to schooling and things like that, is, can you really question what God has said? Well, you've already established that what that text is what every word that God said. And again, when we look at Revelation 16:5, that's what Beza said, because it's not what Stephanus said. It's not what, because Stephanus was going off of the evidence. Erasmus was going off of the evidence. Beza was not going off of evidence. He was going off of what was in his mind. So why should I conclude what God said is what Beza said and not Stephanus? The parallels in Genesis 3 do not fit what we're talking about here, because again, when you look at, I'll go back to the examples, the churches down in North Africa at Carthage, writing to the churches in the West who had their list. Do you realize that the books of the Bible ended up being the same, but how they read in every place did not? The churches in Carthage had nuances and variances in their texts from the ones in Rome, but they had the same books and the overall same message. But guess what? Though they were affirming the same books, the readings were different. So who had it? Was Rome, were they missing God's word? They just missed out on God's best blessings of preservation, and the people in Carthage had it? I mean, where do we go with this argument? I cannot cope with it anymore. I know that was a question that was asked to me all the time. The parallels are not there. What Satan was asking Eve was not in the same realm, but we're asking about the evidence. We're asking about the evidence. We want to know what God said. We're not trying to get rid of what God said. We're trying to get back to it because we believe God moved writers to put it on manuscripts that were passed down, and he said he would protect it. We're not looking to build a text and find and create one. We're looking to discover the one that was already there. And you have to use textual criticism. Beza used textual criticism. Erasmus used textual criticism. They made choices. All of them made choices.